Good morning. It is Thursday, April 16th. We're picking back up with our daily history lessons. I trust that you've finished up the quizzes, the tests, the homework, all that stuff. I'll do my best to grade those. What I'm planning on doing is I will be entering the grades into GradeLink, so you'll be able to see what they are. And then I'll probably create packets that have all your quizzes that you've taken. I'll resubmit them to you so that way you can see the grade on them and see exactly what it was that either lowered your grade or just to give you an idea what's going on. Okay, with that being said, we are going to pick up on chapter 22. We are entering into World War II. By the mid-1930s, the governments of Germany, Italy, and Japan had all come to two conclusions. The first was that military power was essential for both domestic and foreign policy. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, for example, Germany. Germany needed to become a powerful military. As concerning their domestic policy, they needed to provide jobs. One of the best ways to provide jobs: build tanks, build trains, build planes, build bombs. They needed to have the government have complete power. So having a powerful military was necessary for their domestic policy, but also necessary for their foreign policy. Germany wanted to be able to push other nations around. The second conclusion, first was military power. The second conclusion was that nationalism was their transcendent purpose. What was the point of existence? Why did an individual live? Well, they lived to serve the state. They lived to elevate their nation. And the highest good was to make your nation great. And so it becomes essentially an idol, something to be worshipped. Their shared commitments allowed these three nations to form some form of alliance. We'll see how that went down. On the other hand, England, France, and the United States were spending as little money on the military as possible. They were each, to different degrees and for various reasons, trying to build welfare states in the midst of a depression, and that required a tremendous amount of capital. Every dollar that was spent on the United States military was one less dollar that could be spent on Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And so, as you can imagine, Roosevelt devoted very little to the military. So the American military had grown very, very weak. The English and French militaries were better, although not much better. They at least had the advantage of seeing in advance the problems that were coming, and so they started to invest a little better into the mid and late 1930s. Russia, on the other hand, was in the process of destroying itself. Joseph Stalin had initiated the Great Purge. He was going through and murdering as many of the high command as possible and just generally destroying the nation. And so you have on one hand Germany, Italy, and Japan, which would later be known as the Axis powers, preparing for a fight. You have on the other hand France, England, and the United States, who would be eventually known as the Allied powers, as they were doing very little to prepare themselves, and then Russia was just its own. In Japan, the post-World War I negotiations had reshaped Japan. So whereas Japan was a member of the Allies in World War I, and they had eliminated German influence in the Pacific, they discovered they were still held in low regard. After the war, Japan felt that they had earned the right to be treated as an equal. They had demonstrated their superiority. They had demonstrated their competence with Western arms, and they felt it was time for them to assume their place among the nations of the world. But the racism of the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Treaty was so strong is that they were rejected out of hand. And this builds within Japan an understanding that if they're going to become great, they're going to have to take it by force. And that was the only thing that the Western world would respect. So Japan continued to assert new influence over Asia under the reign of the new emperor, whose name was Hirohito. And there was a series of governments that progressively grew more and more militaristic. Japan primarily set its eyes on China as their prize. China had great riches but very little power. So let's turn our attention to China and understand what made it so desirable to Japan. In China, we had Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He had organized the Kuomintang Party. This party rebelled against the Manchu dynasty. The Manchu dynasty was the last of the imperial dynasties of China. It was weak, it was pathetic, it was powerless. And so there were a number of political organizations that had risen to challenge it. In reality, by the end of the Manchu dynasty, China was a broken state with warlords all over it, each controlling their own dominion and demanding demanding wealth wherever they could find it. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was a firm believer in China for the Chinese. He had seen the results of the Boxer Rebellion. He had seen the humiliation of the Chinese at the hands of the Western powers in the early 1900s. But he also recognized if that was going to happen, then China was going to have to grow strong. Right now, China was being pushed around because China could be pushed around. China was unable to resist anything the European powers wanted to do. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen realized China needed to grow in its modernization, both in military and economics. He lived long enough to see people rise, but not long enough to see his hopes established. So he started something, but he was not able to see through it to its end. When Dr. Sun Yat-sen died, a successor was chosen. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. The dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, as I mentioned, was no longer controlled. China was largely a series of warlords. China was completely divided. So Chiang Kai-shek tried to unite under his rule through military power. The Kuomintang Party developed a capable and powerful military, probably as close to a Western military as any force in China, but that was a fairly low standard. This is Chiang Kai-shek, as he was later. We're just going to see his role within Chinese politics. This led to civil war. Now, the civil war is not between the Manchu dynasty and the Kuomintang Party, as you would expect. The Manchu dynasty was far too weak. The civil war actually erupts between Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang Party, and Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party. They are competing. Now, as I mentioned, all these warlords would ally themselves with either Mao Zedong or Chiang Kai-shek. It usually depended on who had paid the largest bribe and who was closest in proximity. The warlords would change their allegiances time and time again. They were simply looking for their own safety, for their own good. But the two main groups within this Chinese Civil War are the Communist and the Kuomintang Party. By the 1930s, China was loosely unified under the Kuomintang Party, but the communists had real power in the interior with the peasants. So if we were to look at China, the coastal regions, the developed urban regions, largely under the control of Chiang Kai-shek, but the interior, where the rice was being produced, where the peasants were, that was still largely to Mao Zedong. Then in 1931, the Japanese invasion changed everything. Japan, who had long since established themselves in Manchuria, which is a portion of northern China, they staged a fake train explosion. They claimed that the Chinese had entered their territory and blew up the train. It was one of the most embarrassing train explosions in history. They used way too little power. It didn't even do any real damage. But regardless, it was just an excuse, and so Japan proceeded to invade the rest of China. Excuse me, I wrote that down wrong. So they proceeded to invade China, not Japan. The army of Japan declared war without permission or even knowledge of by the civilian government in Tokyo. This shows you that reality was that Japan was actually a military dictatorship. The prime minister back in Tokyo had no idea this was happening. And by the time he was informed, the Japanese army had already taken massive parts of China. Japan's brutality was immense. They tried to hide it in later years, but Japan utterly annihilated and massacred so many of the Chinese people. It was seen in the rape of Nanjing, which was a city within China. A Japanese newspaper followed a contest in which Japanese soldiers competed to behead the most people. And this wasn't beheading in battle. These were prisoners and civilians who were being murdered. It was straight murder. One of the Japanese princes oversaw much of the atrocity. Even to this day, there's a myth that the Japanese imperial family was not aware of this. This time Emperor Hirohito had a brother, I think his name was Akihito, who not only knew of it, but actually helped supervise it and further it. So the entire Japanese government was committed to this great evil. So in mid-1930s, Japan is now invading China. Now let's turn our attention to Italy. Italy saw an opportunity to rebuild the Roman Empire. Mussolini styled himself much like the Caesars of old, and so he wanted to build an empire, and he turned his attention to North Africa. So in 1935, Ethiopia mobilized in response because Italy built a fort in their territory, a military fort in Ethiopian land. So this was an invasion. The Italians were victorious over the Ethiopians, though they lost a few battles, which was utterly surprising. It was amazing that a modern military could lose to an African nation. Italy even had to use poison gas against Ethiopians. These are the Italian soldiers as they march through Ethiopia. And you might think, well, why did they want Ethiopia? There wasn't a tremendous amount of material wealth there. Largely, it was the prestige. Mussolini wanted an empire, and for an empire, it requires land. In Germany, the desire for territorial expansion started with former German territories. So we have Japan is invading China, we have Italy is invading Ethiopia, and now we have Germany. Germany is looking at all these lands that were once part of the Holy Roman Empire, that were once part of maybe a greater Germany, and saying we want them back. Hitler envisaged a Third Reich that would last for 1,000 years. That's what he thought he was going to establish. And this included what was called Lebensraum, which was living space for pure Germans. Hitler believed he needed to have lots of land where racially pure Germans would be able to settle and colonize. This would mean that non-Germans would need to be murdered. They'd need to be destroyed. So he proceeded to remilitarize his French border and began to plan for an invasion of the south. Now, directly to the south was the nation of Czechoslovakia. Hitler at this point realized they had no allies. So in 1936, Hitler and Mussolini came to an agreement called the Rome-Berlin Axis, meaning that they thought that the world would revolve around the relationship between Rome, which is in Italy, and Berlin, which is in Germany. That's how they got the name of the Axis powers. In 1936, Germany also signed what was called the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, which was really about Russia. Because remember, Stalin had started the Comintern, which was a group of international communist parties designed to spread the revolution all over the world. And the two people that hated each other were the Nazis and the communists. And they were both evil, both awful, but they both hated each other because they were so similar in most of their beliefs. So Germany signs the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, and so together Germany, Italy, and Japan are all confederated. The first taste of the coming conflict that was going to be World War II actually started with the Spanish Civil War of 1936. The monarchy was under tremendous pressure. Spain was poor and destitute and failing. The fascists supported General Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union supported the communists. So it became what's called a proxy war. A proxy war is when the main combatants fight through smaller groups. So really, the Spanish Civil War was about Nazi Germany fighting communist Soviet Union. But neither of the nations officially got involved. They sent things indirectly. They sent men, materials. It was a chance really for both sides to test their military equipment and strategies. Thousands died and significant parts of Spain were destroyed. In the end, the fascists and General Francisco Franco were victorious. And the Germans were allowed to test all of their military equipment and devise a number of new strategies. It was an education that can only come through experience. One of the chief of these developments was the use of what was called the dive bomber, the Stuka dive bomber. And this was a new idea using air support closely tied to ground advances. So the dive bomber would fly in, it would turn, go straight down, and it would drop its bombs on individual targets such as tanks. Never before had bombing been so precise. You could actually aim it. Now, it required skill, and it required a lot of fighter planes to protect the dive bombers as they went into their dive, but it was remarkably effective within the Spanish Civil War and, in fact, the early days of World War. Guernica is famous for a painting that was painted by Pablo Picasso that demonstrated the destruction there. This is the ruins of one of the Spanish towns that was devastated during the war. In 1938, with the Spanish Civil War done and Hitler now having bloodied his army, having given it experience and some new tactics and equipment, Hitler decided to make a bolder move, and this was called the Anschluss. This united Hitler's homeland of Austria with Germany. It was a major violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and it should have been a wake-up call to the rest of Europe, but it was not. And so now Austria becomes part of Germany, and this is, I believe, Vienna, as the Nazis roll through. And many Austrians were quite content with development. Now, this was also the era of the movie Sound of Music, if you've ever watched that. That was filmed about the Anschluss. With this success, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, a nation with 3.5 million ethnic Germans in it. Czechoslovakia was reasonably strong. It was prosperous, it was stable, it had signed treaties with England and with France. And so in a very real way, Czechoslovakia should have been able to stand up to Germany. Czechoslovakia had a solid military, it had developed a defensive wall against Germany, and it had the two allies. Hitler demanded it must become part of Germany. Germany had been building rapidly its military, both in technology and size. They were years ahead of the rest of Europe, and it seemed as if Europe was about to go back to war. So England and France rushed to meet with Hitler. Now remember, they had made promises that if Czechoslovakia was attacked, they would both go to war to defend Czechoslovakia. So Prime Minister of England during this time was a man named Neville Chamberlain, and he took the lead. He took the lead in negotiating with the Germans to prevent the war that was bound to be coming. Now, very pointedly, Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that would decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. In an act of cowardice and betrayal, and that's the only ways it can be described, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, gave away the most important and valuable part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. He gave away the part that contained the defensive fortifications. He gave away the part that produced a lot of the raw material necessary for the Czechoslovakian economy. He did it without asking the Czechoslovakians. It was not Chamberlain's land to give. It was a tremendous act of moral cowardice, and rightfully so. Chamberlain is remembered for his utter failure, and England and France are remembered for their stabbing in the back of what should have been an ally. The Germans, after they were given the large part of Czechoslovakia, simply rolled through and took the rest of it. England celebrated, except for a single curmudgeon we're going to talk about. When Neville Chamberlain returned to England, this is Neville Chamberlain as he is arrived on the airport. He's holding up a document called the Munich Agreement, and he tells the nation, "I have achieved peace for our time." He believes that he has held off another world war, he has satisfied Hitler, and there will be no war. Once again, not only was an act of cowardice and betrayal, it was also an act of utter stupidity. Hitler was not going to be satisfied. And as I mentioned, there was one curmudgeon who knew this. One old man who had been around seemingly forever, who everyone hated because he was always such a doleful, bellowing man who kept saying. His name was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill called it a tremendous act of betrayal. He criticized everyone. He said war was coming and that England needed to prepare, and nobody wanted to listen to him. Hitler, after the Munich Agreement, now realized the Allies would do nothing to stop him. And so he began to look for other places that he would be able to find and to take. He was convinced that nobody in the West had the courage. In fact, he wanted a war. He thought he could win it, but he was convinced nobody in the West would have the courage to stop him. Okay, so we will continue in the days ahead. Now keep listening, please. I want you to write this number down. I want you to write down the numbers 139. 139. I want you to email me at jstamp26@hotmail.com. It is the email I've been saying. So here's the email right here. jstamp26@hotmail.com. So I want you to email me the number 139 as soon as you listen to this video. I think you should be able to do it by Friday evening. So I am working on ways of taking attendance, and this is one of them. So if you see this, I'm asking you on your word of honor, do not notify your friends. Do it for yourself. Let them watch the video. Let them give me an email to let me see as to who is watching. So we will pick up again tomorrow. Thank you very much.